It's now time for this week's State of Wrestling.
Yes, it is time for this week's State of Wrestling here on Notsam Wrestling. Of course, from the Notsam studio, as always. If you want to see what the studio looks like, if you want to watch the State of Wrestling, the only place to do it is for you Notsam shills on Patreon. Patreon.com/NotsamWrestling is the exclusive home to the video version of the State of Wrestling. Every week it goes up at the same time as the podcast goes up, so check it out if you're interested in something like that. Also, the podcast goes up early at patreon.com/NotSamWrestling and ad-free every single week. Now, let's get into the State of Wrestling, the top 5 stories as I see them, and we're going to break them down. The story number 5 is actually a two-pronged story this week. Part of it has to do with Hulk Hogan, and part of it has to do with a WWE Instagram post that went out late last week. So, we'll start with Hulk Hogan, I guess. Hulk Hogan, he's putting out these videos that say the NWO is getting back together, which, they're getting back together for autograph signings. It's not quite the same as the NWO getting back together, but regardless, there'll be fun autograph signings. And he said that the NWO would destroy the Shield, which, I don't know what the question he's asking is. If you're saying right now, if there was a match between Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash, and Scott Hall versus Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins, and Dean Ambrose, in 2018, the Shield is a much better faction than old NWO. But if you're saying the entire NWO from 98 comes over to face the Shield from 2018, yes, the NWO is a huge, huge faction, and they would win just because they have the numbers. And quite frankly, they have Virgil. And we all know whichever faction has Virgil, that's the faction that's going to wind up on top. But the bigger question is, which is the better faction? Maybe that's what you're asking. Which is the better wrestling stable, the NWO or the Shield? Which brings us to the real topic of conversation for story number 5 in the State of Wrestling this week, which is an Instagram post that WWE put out last week. And it said, and I think they put this out on Twitter as well, but it was an image, and it said, 10 best factions of all time. And here's the list that the WWE put out, the photos of everything. Number 10, the Undisputed Era. Number 9, the Freebirds. Number 8, the Nexus, who Wade Barrett, who was on the podcast earlier today, was a member. Number 7, the Hart Foundation, and that's, of course, the 1997 Hart Foundation, not the tag team, but the faction, the stable. That's Bret Hart and Jim the Anvil Neidhart, but also Owen Hart, British Bulldog, and Brian Pillman. The New Day comes in at number 6, Evolution at number 5, the New World Order at number 4, D-Generation X at number 3, the Four Horsemen at number 2, and the Shield at the number 1 best faction of all time. I, like most of you, have a lot of problems with this list. The Shield is not the greatest faction of all time. Some of these people don't belong on the list, but the whole thing needs to be completely reorganized. The Shield could go down, theoretically, as the greatest faction of all time, maybe, but it's going to need to be around for a little bit longer. The first incarnation of the Shield was great, but only lasted so long. A lot of people think that they broke the Shield up right at the peak, which maybe you would have more discussion of them being one of the great factions of all time had you let them go the distance a little bit longer. The Shield, unlike most factions, you go through the members of these factions, and the Shield is one of the very few who all 3 members are main event guys and will be main event guys for the foreseeable future. That definitely puts them in the running of top 10. To me, they belong on the list, but they're not the best faction of all time. I'll tell you, first of all, who should not be on the list. The Undisputed Era should not be on the list. That's Kyle O'Reilly, that's Bobby Fish, that's Adam Cole, and of course, Roddy Strong. Here's why I don't think they should be on the list. That's because they're too new. Like, they're definitely for the great wrestlers. Like, I'm a huge fan of the Undisputed Era. They're one of the best factions right now. But if they broke up tomorrow, they're barely a footnote. You know what I mean? All four of these guys are going to go on to have great careers, I believe. I've vouched for all of them here on the podcast. But as a faction, they haven't done enough yet to be in the conversation of top 10. They're just right now. I mean, I would argue that in terms of NXT factions, if you're just talking NXT, Sanity has, if you look at the history of Sanity, everything Sanity ever did, they would probably rank higher on a list of factions than everything the Undisputed Era has done so far. At the end of the day, I think the Undisputed Era are going to definitely be a better faction than Sanity. But as of today, they shouldn't be on the list. The Nexus should not be on the list. The Nexus, they had, as we talked about earlier on the podcast, they had a great debut. They had a great, amazing jumping onto the scene when they tore apart the ring, when they beat up John Cena and they beat up CM Punk, and they just destroyed Raw. It was one of the great moments in the history of Raw. But that one moment is not enough to put them on the list. It's not enough, I don't think. They had the potential to be one of the best factions of all time, but because they ran out of steam, to me, not one of the top 10 best factions of all time. It led to a couple of spin-offs. I think the New Nexus was not a good faction. I think the Core was not a good faction. If you look down the list, the Nexus, Wade Barrett, Justin Gabriel, Michael Tarver, David Otunga, and Heath Slater, Darren Young. Was David Otunga only in the New Nexus or the old Nexus? No, he was in the original Nexus. And Darren Young. Daniel Bryan lasted one day in the Nexus, but that doesn't count. None of those guys went on to big fame, though. None of those guys went on to a world championship in WWE anyway. So I can't put the Nexus on the list. They had the potential, but they didn't end up on the list. Not for me. I don't think the New Day should be on the list, only because I don't view the New Day as a faction. I view the New Day as a three-man tag team. And the difference is that the Freebirds also worked as solo competitors. Michael Hayes, Terry Gordy specifically, Buddy Roberts a little bit. They also had a fourth member, by the way, Jimmy Garvin, which automatically makes them a faction. But I believe that the Freebirds work just as much as singles as they do a team. Whereas the New Day, while they have singles matches, let's be honest, they're a team, right? They're not going for any singles titles. They're going for the tag titles only. So to me, the New Day is a tag team. It's the same reason why Demolition wouldn't be on this list. Demolition is a three-person tag team, not a faction. In ECW, the Triple Threat, that's a three-person faction. Bam Bam Bigelow, Chris Candido, the franchise Shane Douglas. That is a three-man faction because they all work separately as well as in a group unit. The Brood, that is a three-man faction because they work separately, Edge over here, Gangrel over here, Christian over here, as well as a three-man group. The New Day is a three-person tag team. Demolition, a three-person tag team. Just the way I view things. So New Day should not be on the list. And quite frankly, I don't think Evolution makes my top 10. And I think that was probably because they weren't around for that long. I think Evolution would absolutely make my top 20. They would not make my top 10. I gave this a lot of thought, and there's a lot of factions that should get honorable mention. I think the Nation of Domination deserves honorable mention. I think they were great in the Attitude Era. Revolutionary, too. The Wyatt family deserves honorable mention. They didn't reach their potential, though. I think a faction, in order to be on this list, has to have reached their potential, at least. The Wyatt family did not reach their potential. That's why. And I think the Blue World Order, believe it or not, from ECW, as well as the factions I already mentioned, the Triple Threat, the Blue World Order deserves honorable mention, not to be on the top 10 list, but honorable mention, because Stevie Richards was a main event ECW star as a member of the BWO. The BWO sold a ton of shirts. The BWO is a very popular faction. Now, you could say that a lot of that had to do with how popular the NWO was, and you'd be right. But the LWO, for instance, the Latino World Order, that does not make the honorable mention list. The Blue World Order makes the list ahead of the Latino World Order by a lot, to me, in terms of greatest factions. But I put together my top 10 list. You're going to say, well, Sam, you can't just nitpick the WWE's list. I took off Undisputed Era. I took off the Nexus. I took off the New Day. I took off Evolution. I think the Freebirds, the Hart Foundation, the NWO, DX, the Four Horsemen, and the Shield, those 6 factions from the WWE's top 10 list all deserve to be on that list, but not in the order that they are listed. So here we go. I'm going to add 4 more teams, and I'm going to reorder. Here, to me, is your list, as it stands today, of the top 10 factions in wrestling. I'm going to start with number 10. On this list, we have representation of the Monday Night War Attitude Era with DX and the NWO. We have representation, and the Hart Foundation. We have representation of the 80s and the NWA with the Four Horsemen and the Freebirds. We have representation of today with the Shield and the Undisputed Era. And we have representation of 5 to 10 years ago, the early 2010s, the post-Attitude Era with the Nexus, WWE's list. What we don't have representation of is the WWE's new generation. Now, the new generation, not an era that's looked on very fondly. The new generation is looked on as a dark time in WWE, a rebuilding period, as it were. But there is a lot of good to come out of the new generation. The Undertaker did a lot in the new generation. Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels rose to fame in the new generation. Duke the Dumpster Droese became a household name in the new generation, but there was one faction that deserves to be mentioned from the new generation. And that one faction is the $1 Million Corporation. The $1 Million Corporation is my number 10 faction of all time. The $1 Million Corporation started with Nikolai Volkov, a superstar who was down on his luck. He had to wear a t-shirt with it looked like the $1 Million Man's tuxedo, but it was a tuxedo t-shirt. And instead of a dollar sign, it was a cent sign all over it because he was down on his luck. He didn't want to be with the $1 Million Man, but he was forced to. The $1 Million Corporation gave us the Supreme Fighting Machine, Kama Mustafa, who would later go on to become Kama and the Godfather, who previously had been Papa Shango. But that was that gave us an opponent for The Undertaker and the melted urn that he wore as a chain. The $1 Million Corporation gave us context for the return of King Kong Bundy in the new generation of the WWE. The $1 Million Corporation gave a home to Erwin R. Shyster after leaving that sort of character-driven early 90s. Well, what do we do with IRS? We put him in the $1 Million Corporation. The $1 Million Corporation also gave us a feud for Lex Luger after the Yokozuna experiment did not work, and that was Tatanka. Everybody was hooked on it. Is Lex Luger, did he sell out? The term sell out, right? That was, the $1 Million Corporation was all about, and it gave a role for Ted DiBiase in the mid-90s, post-wrestling. Commentary did not work for him. The $1 Million Corporation did. The idea that everybody has a price, right? Okay, well, we kind of saw that with the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, but now with the $1 Million Corporation, now we know. Nikolai Volkov has a price. Kama Mustafa has a price. King Kong Bundy has a price. These guys all have a price, and they're all willing to work for the $1 Million Man. Did Lex Luger sell out? Made in the USA. He had us believing that he was all about the kids. He was all about helping. He was all about being a good guy. But Tatanka knew that Lex Luger had sold out, only for us all to be swerved and to find out that the Native American hero Tatanka was the one who sold out after all. The $1 Million Corporation gave us heel Tatanka right around 1995. Now, the $1 Million Corporation did end up fizzling out. The last $1 Million champion, of course, this was after the $1 Million Corporation had been disbanded, but was none other than Stone Cold Steve Austin as the ringmaster before Ted DiBiase would go on to WCW as the NWO. But I think the $1 Million Corporation is forgotten a lot because of the new generation era, but deserves some credit. For me, the $1 Million Corporation is number 10 on my list. Number 9, also not listed in the 10 best factions of all time, and that's because number 9 is a faction that was very big. Another heel faction, like the $1 Million Corporation, but this time in early 90s WCW. Again, Very dark period for WCW. A time when most people thought that this wasn't a serious organization. This wasn't an organization that was going to take on WWE. But there was one faction in this group that stood out. There was one faction in this group that if you look at the members now, you're going to be blown away by them. And that faction is the Dangerous Alliance. For me, the Dangerous Alliance is on my list, number 9 best factions of all time. The Dangerous Alliance, that included, of course, Paul Heyman, Paulie Dangerously. That was the first faction that he really got to lead in the mainstream. You're talking about Stunning Steve Austin, who would go on to become Stone Cold Steve Austin. You're talking about the living legend Larry Zbyszko. You're talking about beautiful Bobby Eaton. You're talking about future Hall of Famer Medusa, Alundra Blaze. You're talking about ravishing Rick Rude. Okay, this is a serious faction. Go back. One of the best War Games matches was from 1991, and it was the Dangerous Alliance versus Stinger's Squadron. Now, Stinger's Squadron, not a real faction. Just Sting and some other good guys coming together to try to stop this Dangerous Alliance. Oh, and Arn Anderson was in the Dangerous Alliance too. The greatest spinebuster in the history of wrestling, Arn Anderson, was also in the Dangerous Alliance. How do you beat this team? You don't. Well, you can. There's 8 factions that beat them. But you don't beat them past the point of being on this list. My number 9 team, argue with me if you must, the Dangerous Alliance. They made it. Oh, first of all, every member of that team is worth talking about. No fluff. And they were a shining star in WCW. Well, what does WCW have? Well, they got Sting, and they got the Dangerous Alliance. That's something. That's why they're on this list at number 9. Number 8 was WWE's number 9. That's the Freebirds. I moved them up one spot. WWE had them at 9. I had them at 8. Of course, very, very influential team. You ask now, people still talk about them all the time. Their entrance influenced a lot of people. Terry Gordy, superstar of all time. Michael P.S. Hayes, still influential more than almost anybody else in the wrestling industry, is one of the most creative people in the WWE today behind the scenes. Buddy Roberts and Jimmy Jam Garvin, also in there. Of course, Buddy Roberts did the gimmick that would eventually be used by Kurt Angle, that would eventually be used by CM Punk to some extent, which is disguising your head after the hair versus hair match, directly used by Kurt Angle with the headgear and the wig. But they dominated World Class, one of the most influential television programs of Territory era in terms of wrestling. And the Freebirds and the Von Erichs would go on to headline show after show after show after show for years, you know? So I think the Freebirds absolutely deserve a spot. They are my number 8 faction, not number 9 like WWE says, my number 8 faction of all time. Number 7 faction, also not on the WWE's list. I looked at the WWE's list and I said, you know, there's a lot of factions that I like that are not on this list. The Brood, the Ministry of Darkness, the Corporation. What if I could put them all on this list and only take one spot? The Brood, the Ministry of Darkness, and the Corporation. Don't forget who the higher power was. It was me, Austin. It was me all along. The Corporate Ministry is my number 7 member on this list of 10 best factions of all time. And you might say that that's controversial, but think about it. You had the Corporation and the Ministry and the Brood. You've got Edge in there. You've got Shamrock in there. You got the Boss Man in there. You got the Undertaker in there. You got Bradshaw and Farouk in there. You got Mideon. You got everybody. Everybody. You know, Shane, Vince. To me, this is the ultimate heel, unstoppable faction. Little big, but part of it is because of all the parts. So when I say the Corporate Ministry, I'm also including the Ministry as a separate entity, the Corporation as a separate entity, and the Brood as a separate entity, all coming together to form the Corporate Ministry. The Rock is in there. I mean, my God, I don't see how you can argue that the Corporate Ministry doesn't deserve to be on this list. They ran things for a period of time later in the Attitude Era. Corporate Ministry on my list at number 7. Number 6, WWE's number one team, the Shield. The Shield is my number 6 faction. Like I said earlier, Dean Ambrose, Seth Rollins, and Roman Reigns. Every member of the Shield would go on and will go on to main events. Every member of the Shield, a former WWE champion after the Shield. The Shield would break up, and all 3 members would go on to win the WWE Championship. Unheard of. A faction so popular that you can take a guy getting booed throughout arenas, pair him with the other 2, put on some flak jackets, and he gets cheered. That's Roman Reigns, member of the Shield. The Shield absolutely deserves to be on this list, but for me, not before number 6. The Shield, my number 6 faction of all time. Number 5 faction is the WWE's number 7 faction. My number 5 faction is the Hart Foundation. Bret Hart, Owen Hart, Jim the Anvil Neidhart, the British Bulldog, and Brian Pillman. To me, this was the best work Bret Hart ever did. Best work Owen Hart ever did. Probably not the best work the British Bulldog ever did. But close. Some of the best work the British Bulldog ever did. Might not beat his run in 92. Might not beat that match with Bret. But it could. It's up there with some of the best work the British Bulldog ever did. And great time for Brian Pillman and Jim the Anvil Neidhart as well. The Hart Foundation were the heel faction that ushered in the Attitude Era. For me, the Attitude Era begins right around, I'll say, summer of 97. Canadian Stampede is when it's officially here. But if you think about it, March of 97, WrestleMania, that's when Bret Hart officially turns heel in his match with Stone Cold Steve Austin. By May, I would say, that's when the Hart Foundation is starting to form. Into June, that's when the Attitude Era is starting. The Hart Foundation doesn't get enough credit. First of all, the Hart Foundation were there as Stone Cold Steve Austin's foil before Mr. McMahon was a character. The Hart Foundation was there as a foil to D-Generation X. The formation of D-Generation X happened in a response to the Hart Foundation. They were also, the Nation of Domination, the NOD, was a heel faction, but still went to war with the Hart Foundation because the Hart Foundation were even bigger heels. The Hart Foundation is the quintessential Attitude Era faction in terms of ushering in the Attitude Era. It doesn't happen without the Hart Foundation. They're very underrated as a faction, and that's why I put them at number 5 on my list of top 10 factions. Number 4 is not on the WWE's list, and I can understand why it's not on the WWE's list, but it still deserves to be on the list. Number 4 is only one of only 2 current factions on this list, meaning still in play. The Shield being one of them, and this one. The Bullet Club. The Bullet Club is my number 4 faction of all time. And that's because the Bullet Club starts in New Japan with Devitt, Carl Anderson, Luke Gallows, Tama, and begins this very cool thing that's got everybody buzzing. Everybody buzzing about the Bullet Club, so much so that the WWE needs to hire Finn Balor, Luke Gallows, Carl Anderson. Then, AJ Styles comes in, takes over the Bullet Club. WWE needs to hire AJ Styles. Then, Kenny Omega comes in, takes over the Bullet Club. Kenny Omega becomes the number 1. Right now in 2018, he's the number 1 on PWI 500. Arguably the best wrestler in the world. You know who else the Bullet Club includes? The Elite, Cody Rhodes, and the Young Bucks. Hangman Page, Marty Scurll. The minds behind All In, the show that we just watched. The Bullet Club. The number 1 act in Ring of Honor. To me, one of the main things that is making Ring of Honor as popular as they are is the Bullet Club. And the same thing can be said for New Japan in the United States. Would New Japan be as popular in the United States as they are without the Bullet Club? My answer to you is no. Not to say it wouldn't be popular. You've got Okada. You've got Los Ingobernables. You know, you've got talent. But would New Japan be as popular in the United States without the Bullet Club? No way. The Bullet Club is the most influential faction in 2018. No argument. I don't see how you could possibly argue that. In terms of factions, they are moving the needle like no other group is in wrestling. And they're doing it independently. That's what's so crazy about the Bullet Club. The Bullet Club is the first faction to move beyond a promotion. The Bullet Club is not a New Japan entity anymore. The Bullet Club is not a Ring of Honor entity. The Bullet Club exists as its own entity. And quite frankly, to me, the Balor Club, Finn Balor, Luke Gallows, Carl Anderson, they are an extension, a WWE extension of the Bullet Club. The OGBC. Balor Club, maybe. It's another way of saying Bullet Club. Number 4 faction of all time right now is the Bullet Club. Number 3, we're down to the top 3. We talked about the quintessential Attitude Era faction. Well, the faction that brought the WWE back to prominence, the faction that became culturally iconic, the faction that became a household name, the faction that changed slang, and the faction that still gets quoted by non-wrestling fans today with 2 words, and those words are suck it. It's D-Generation X. Number 3 faction of all time. All versions, Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Chyna, Triple H, X-Pac, Road Dogg, badass Billy Gunn. You could throw in the revamped version with Triple H and Shawn Michaels if you want, but it's not necessary. Even without the revamped version, D-Generation X, number 3 faction of all time, influential, important, brought wrestling to a different place, and influenced people like the Bullet Club, people like the Shield. People are still going around saying, suck it, okay? Still to this day. Why? Because of D-Generation X. The number 2 faction of all time is the faction that made WCW a real threat, okay? A lot of people say that the reason WCW became a threat to WWE's dominance was because they went head-to-head with Nitro. No, it's because they introduced this faction, the New World Order. The NWO is the number 2 faction of all time. How do you beat them? You can't say that. I would not accept any argument, and this includes NWO, NWO Hollywood, NWO Wolfpack. I'm not putting NWO 2000 in there. I'm not putting the LWO. I'm not putting any of those side factions in. But those 3, the NWO original, NWO White and Black, NWO Red and Black, those 3 groups make up the NWO and make up the number 2 faction of all time. People crap on the Wolfpack, but the Wolfpack was back causing mass destruction. Big Sexy was cool. Wolfpack Sting was cool. K-Dog was cool. Even Wolfpack Macho Man was a little bit cool. Then they came back together. Like, look, that was the end. Yes, most of the shine goes to the original formation of the NWO. And yes, it did, end with a sputter, but that's not important. The NWO was able to return in the WWE. Didn't work, but not because the brand was dead, I don't think. I think it's because the brand wasn't presented properly. The NWO became cooler than the promotion that it was in. Very, very rare. People liked the NWO more than they liked WCW. At the end of the day, one of the downfalls of WCW, in my personal opinion. But still, the NWO is one of the biggest, most important, dominant factions of all time. Number 2, the number 1 faction of all time, is the number 2 on this list, and that's the 4 Horsemen. You can't beat the 4 Horsemen. The 4 Horsemen are the blueprint that every wrestling faction is based on. That's Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, Ole Anderson, J.J. Dillon. The original 4 Horsemen. I will even accept Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, Barry Windham, J.J. Dillon. Once you get past that, that's when things start to get shaky. I don't think you need Sid Vicious. I don't think you need Sting, who was only in there for a cup of coffee. Once you get into like the newer, mid-90s versions where you've got Steve McMichael, Dean Malenko, Chris Benoit, Kurt Hennig for a little bit. Still room to talk. Jeff Jarrett. Still a lot of big names. But once the NWO showed up, the 4 Horsemen were not taken as seriously as they once were. But it made Ric Flair go from an 8 to a 10, in my opinion. The Four Horsemen took Ric Flair to a whole other level. It made Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard icons. It made Barry Windham even more famous. The Four Horsemen, the blueprint of every faction in wrestling, deserve to be number one on this list, no doubt about it. So that's it. That's my list of the top 10 factions of all time. The $1 Million Corporation, the Dangerous Alliance, the Freebirds, the Corporate Ministry, the Shield, the Hart Foundation, the Bullet Club, D-Generation X, the NWO, and the Four Horsemen. Hit me up. You can either send me a message on Patreon at patreon.com/NotSamWrestling, or shoot me an email or a tweet or whatever, and let me know what you think of that list. Story number 4. Oh, I'm all worn out. That was an entire state of wrestling just based on that one story. Story number 4, let me get some water. Pentagon and Phoenix. Pentagon and Phoenix, possibly coming to NXT. Earlier in the week, they said it said, well, they're not accepting bookings into next year, making me think that they're going. Phoenix and Pentagon are saying they're not going. But I would imagine at some point, Phoenix and Pentagon will come over, hopefully sooner than later. If you ask me, I don't know what they're doing with 205 Live. You know, as I said, I'm surprised Ricochet for 205 Live didn't end up over there. I like the idea of 205 Live guys popping up on Raw. I think Drake. I think all of them. I think Drew. Why am I drawing a blank? He's been on the podcast before. I can't. Gulak. I was totally drawing a blank. Drew Gulak showing up as part of the heels that beat up Roman Reigns the Shield a couple weeks ago. Drake Maverick showing up as the manager to the AOP. And this week, Lio Rush showing up as like Bobby Lashley's motivational speaker. I like the Lio Rush edition better than any of them. But I like what they're doing with the 205 Live guys. I think Phoenix could be a good addition to 205. But if he's not going to be at 205, I would put Phoenix on NXT. And I would have Pentagon go directly to SmackDown and start a rivalry with Andrade Almas right away. I think Pentagon is ready to be a star. Don't change his look, don't change his name, just put him right on TV, right with Andrade, and let's go. Right off to the races. So they're saying they're not going right now. I would imagine that they'll be there sooner than later. Story number 3. Renee Young as head comment or as permanent commentary on Monday Night Raw. It makes me so happy to see Renee Young in that position. First of all, you can hear it in the commentary. This is a great team. And I'll tell you, in real life, Renee, Cole, and Graves at this moment are all very happy to be with each other. They're all real life friends. They all real life like each other. They all real life respect each other's abilities. They all want to be there, not only because they like each other, but because they respect each other and what they can bring to the table. Renee, Cole, and Graves all bring different things, all have very clear roles. Graves is going to be able to be what Graves always has been. Cole is going to be able to do the play-by-play. And Renee is going to bring that sort of pleasant disposition, likability to the show in a voice that we're not used to hearing on TV, but we should have it, quite frankly, on TV. I think we're all going to get a treat. If you're paying attention closely, you're going to be able to watch Renee grow and learn and blossom into the great color commentator that she's going to become right in front of you. You can already hear the difference between the first week and this week. And I think that is she's going to get better and better and better. But the fact that this is where we're starting at, commentary is a completely different skill set, a completely different animal from hosting the kickoff shows and from doing backstage interviews. It's completely different. You know, it's a different skill set. It's like going from interviews to wrestling in a match, right? It is totally different. It takes different training. It's different is what I'm trying to say. So, you know, I think that the fact that Renee is starting at the level that she's starting at, and granted, this is not her first time doing commentary. Of course, she did 2 weeks of Raw previously. She did the Mae Young Classic, and before this, she had done commentary on Superstars and on NXT TV, but that had been years ago, years ago. And who knows, I don't know how much training she got for those and how much of it was just like, I'm jumping in. It's clear to me, watching the Mae Young Classic and listening to her on Raw, that she has spent a considerable amount of time with Michael Cole and Corey Graves, and that she is actively, and Renee Young is a crazy hard worker. Every kickoff show that I've ever done with her, she's written all of her own stuff. This isn't somebody else writing her script for her. She has come in and is not making it up off the top of her head. She's got her computer open before the show, and she's got all her verbiage all written out. Like I don't mean like the conversations, because obviously those are off the cuff. But the fact that she's able, you can always count on Renee. You've never seen her get lost in conversation on one of those kickoff shows, ever. You've never seen her have something get thrown at her and she goes, ever. She knows the product like the back of her hand. She's actually a fan of the product. She enjoys talking about wrestling, and you can tell, and it comes across. And she's willing to do the work, and still willing to do the work. She hasn't gotten this big head because she's really, really good at doing what she's doing. She's still willing to do the work, and it's just going to continuously get better. It also is this like moment beyond wrestling. It's the same way I felt when I saw Charlemagne the God do this interview with Kanye West. And I sent him an email and told him how cool it was to see him doing that interview, mainly because I got this feeling of people from our generation taking the seat, right? People from our generation no longer waiting to be like, one day, today's the day. And Renee Young represents the new generation, our generation, stepping forward and being like, no, we're not kids. You know, we're here to take the seat. We're here to grab the spot now. We're ready for it. And Renee Young is jumping in with both feet, and she's grabbing the spot, and she's ready for it, and she's proving it, and she's going to continue to prove it. Very bummed that she won't be on the kickoff shows anymore. I loved doing those kickoff shows with her, and I hate that she won't be on them. I'm sure I'm going to have a lot of fun with Coach, who's now doing the kickoff shows, and of course, still doing the NXT shows with Charlie and Pat McAfee. So those are still going to be great, and it's all good news, I think, for everybody. But yeah, Renee Young is in the spot that she should be in, and I have a good feeling that the Raw commentary team is going to get really, really good and just get better and better and better. And I think that this will also bring out the best of Michael Cole. I don't think Michael Cole gets enough credit, respect, just desserts. Michael Cole is amazing at what he does. Not just on camera, because he is amazing at what he does on commentary, but behind the scenes, he's out of this world good. And that's clear from the entire product. So such congratulations to Renee Young. She's doing an amazing job. And I think she's going to continue to do an amazing job. And I love seeing her get to be part of this revolution. It's a big deal. It's history. And Renee Young's making it happen. Story number 2, speaking of making it happen, I'm watching Raw this week, and I see this guy coming down the aisle looking young and spry, moving like I haven't seen him move in years, jumping up on the apron to get into the ring and delivering a promo that is on the level of anything that he did in the Attitude Era. Story number 2 is the amazing performance on Raw that we got from Mick Foley this week. Mick Foley going to Hell in a Cell to be the special guest referee between Roman Reigns and Braun Strowman. Now, on paper, it's kind of like, why? I get that he was in a Hell in a Cell, but he's been away from the product and has nothing to do with this story. And while all that's true, he made me a believer. He made me a believer as I watched Raw. I was like, whoa, Mick Foley is back. I don't know what he had done surgically, but he is moving like I haven't seen him moved in years. And the promo that he delivered was outstanding. The promo that he delivered made me a believer. The promo that he delivered made me a believer in the fact that he will be a good addition to the Hell in a Cell match between Braun and Roman at the Hell in a Cell pay-per-view. So, you know, I don't know what else to say about Mick Foley, but just, it was as good as I've seen him in years. And it was so great to see him back performing at that level and moving at that level, quite frankly. Awesome. Awesome. And I think this means Mick Foley is pretty far from done. I think we're going to be seeing quite a bit more of Mick Foley after the performance that we saw on Raw. And if that's the Mick Foley that we're getting, it's going to be very, very welcome. By the way, I tweeted out a thing about how great Mick Foley was, and then after that I wrote Foley is good. Some people, and they were not joking. There were a couple people that were joking, I'm sure, but some people were not joking. And they said, don't you mean God? Sam, extra O in there. Are you crazy? Extra O? Mick Foley, when Foley is God was a thing, when all those signs were being held up and everything, Mick came out and said, I'm not God, but throw in an extra O, and I am good. And they made a t-shirt that said Foley is good with the extra O pointed up above the God, and it said God had obviously been turned into good. And he wrote a book called Foley is Good. I meant Foley is good. It was a thing. What are you, cheering for Mick Foley now and you don't even remember the Foley is Good era? Get the hell out of here. What the heck are you talking about? We got the old Mick Foley back, folks, and it makes me very, very excited. Speaking of Hell in a Cell, number one story of the week is the Hell in a Cell pay-per-view coming up this weekend. I don't know. If you think for the folks on Patreon, for the Not Sam Shills, at patreon.com/NotSamWrestling, sign up to be a Not Sam Shill if you haven't already. You'll get the podcast early and ad-free. You'll get at least 2 bonus shows a month. You're going to get all of the previous captive audience shows that were released. And that's just for the first tier. We also have available the interview videos from the podcast coming out the same day the podcast comes out, the exclusive video for the State of Wrestling. We've got a bonus Q&A every month. We've got a bonus live video pre-show that's interactive every month. We've got merchandise. We've got bonus videos. There's a video right now on Patreon for the Superstar and Hall of Fame level, Not Sam Shills, of Joey Janela training my dog. I'm going to go off to the Performance Center this week. There's going to be video from the Performance Center that's only going to be available there. Patreon.com/NotSamWrestling. A lot of fun stuff. But if you want this weekend some kind of Hell in a Cell bonus show, pre or post show, we'll see. You let me know. Hit me up in the Discord room. And by the way, if you already are Not Sam Shill, get into that Discord room because it is really fun. It's a great community of people talking about, way more than just Not Sam Wrestling. They're talking about WWE. They're talking about what's going on in their lives. It's an amazing, amazing thing that we're creating with the Not Sam Shills at patreon.com/NotSamWrestling. Hell in a Cell has been an interesting build, I really think. And if you go over the matches, it might be a little bit more SmackDown heavy than Raw heavy, but not that much. Aside from this week on Raw, this has really been a show that has been promoted on SmackDown more so than anywhere else. Raw has been promoting Evolution. Raw has been promoting Super Showdown in Australia very heavily, while SmackDown has been taking the lion's share of promoting Hell in a Cell. Although Raw did promote Hell in a Cell pretty heavily in the go-home show this week. Still, it'll be interesting to see because I think the feeling that a lot of people have is that it's not that big of a show because it hasn't been promoted as big as some shows have been. But the card is pretty good. Let's go over the card. We found out this week Raw Tag Team Championship is on the line. Dolph Ziggler and Drew McIntyre versus The Shield. I would have Dolph and Drew win the match, keep the championship, because I'm going to save that championship for Finn Balor and Braun Strowman after Hell in a Cell. But there's going to be, some chicanery. But I think if Dean Ambrose and Seth Rollins lose, then we can start to build this idea that maybe it's not the Shield's night, and it would draw Roman and his ability to beat Braun Strowman a little bit more into question if Seth and Dean lose. So I would keep the titles for now on Dolph Ziggler and Drew McIntyre. We've got the SmackDown Tag Team Championships. New Day versus a team that's going to be announced on SmackDown. We're recording State of Wrestling this week before SmackDown because I'm traveling on Wednesday. But I personally hope that the Bar wins on SmackDown and wins the Tag Team Championship. I think that it's time for the Bar to have a nice tag title run on SmackDown. They're a great team and can be a great asset to SmackDown if used properly. We go into a mixed tag team match. It's Daniel Bryan and Brie Bella versus The Miz and Maurice. I think that The Miz and Maurice should win this match. Little interference from Maurice, but I think The Miz should get another pinfall victory over Daniel Bryan. I don't think Daniel Bryan should be able to beat The Miz. I think it's already been announced. I believe it has, that there's another Miz-Daniel Bryan match at Super Showdown. Unless I'm wrong. There might not be. Maybe I'm making it up, but I think that that's been announced. I think I think that should be the last time that these two guys touch. I think that after this match, The Miz wins. Super Showdown, The Miz wins. The Miz says, enough. Bryan, you got to move on to something else. Bryan can maybe move on to Samoa Joe, who will not be the champion because The Miz goes after AJ Styles, and at Survivor Series or at the December pay-per-view, beats AJ Styles for the WWE Championship. I think that The Miz should beat AJ Styles for the championship at Survivor Series. He should beat him again in a rematch at the December pay-per-view, and then move on at the Royal Rumble. But yes, I think that, or we could do some Nakamura-Daniel Bryan matches leading after this Miz stuff is over, which would be very, very exciting. But I think then we do what we talked about doing. The Miz needs to beat Daniel Bryan every time, win the WWE Championship in November. Hold the WWE Championship until WrestleMania, where Daniel Bryan, for the first time since Super Showdown, whatever it's called, first time since October. October, no more Daniel Bryan Miz matches. November, December, January, February, March. 5 months later, he goes to WrestleMania to challenge The Miz for the WWE Championship. The Miz says, you've had your shots. You can't beat me. Daniel Bryan gets one more chance to try to beat him. That's your story going into WrestleMania 35. For me. Which leads me to the WWE Championship match between AJ Styles and Samoa Joe. This is it? No, they're doing one more at Super Showdown. But still, after Super Showdown, we got to move on. I think AJ gets the clean win here. AJ gets a clean win. We move on to Hell in a Cell matches. We've got Jeff Hardy and Randy Orton in a Hell in a Cell. It's weird that this one's in a Hell in a Cell. I can only predict that Jeff Hardy may be starting to get ready to retire. You know, maybe Jeff Hardy doesn't have too much left in the tank and figures before he retires, he's going to do this Hell in a Cell. I think we're going to see a Jeff Hardy leap off the cage. You know, we watched Mick Foley get thrown off the cage over and over and over again. Clearly, they're a little bit more open to those leaps. We saw Kevin Owens take a bump off the cage. We saw Shane McMahon take a leap off the cage. I think Jeff Hardy's going to swanton bomb off the Hell in a Cell at this pay-per-view. And it's going to be incredible at this point in his life that he's doing that. Incredible. Women's championship matches. First, you've got Ronda Rousey champion versus Alexa Bliss. I wouldn't hate it if Alexa Bliss won. I think Ronda Rousey will probably win, but I wouldn't hate it if Alexa Bliss gave Ronda Rousey her first defeat. We saw Ronda Rousey take a bit of a beating on Raw from Mickie James. I wouldn't hate it if Alexa Bliss won, but I think Ronda Rousey will probably win. Charlotte Flair versus Becky Lynch, as I said earlier in the show, in the bridge segment. Go back and listen to that if you didn't. I would have Peyton Royce interfere in this match and I would have Peyton Royce interfere in this match in Charlotte's favor and have Becky lose because Peyton Royce interfered. Peyton Royce will cost Becky Lynch this match if it's up to me. Then we move on. Well, I told you, go to the bridge segment and I'll clear it all up for you. And then, of course, the main event, special guest, referee, Mick Foley. Braun Strowman cashes in his Money in the Bank briefcase contract. Just a Money in the Bank contract. It's in a briefcase. Hell in a Cell, Roman Reigns versus Braun Strowman. We're going to see some destruction of this cell. It's going to be a hard-fought match. We're going to think that Roman doesn't have anything left in him. Roman is going to close the show with the hero's win. I think so. We're going to see Dolph Ziggler and Drew McIntyre interfere. It's not going to do Braun Strowman a lick of good. I want him to then next night on Raw say, I don't need you guys anymore, and they jump him, and that starts that. You can go into the bridge segment for more details on both the Braun idea and the Charlotte idea. But that's what I've got going on. That's what I think about Hell in a Cell. Let me know on Patreon if you want a Hell in a Cell bonus show, and we will see you next week. Thank you for tuning in to the State of Wrestling, to Notsam Wrestling. We'll see you next week, right here on Notsam Wrestling.
Thanks for listening. Follow at Notsam on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube.
Rate, review, and subscribe. This has been Not Sam Wrestling.